The fist weapons are a very small but hard-hitting weapon category. They are paired types of weapons to when you actually two-hand them, it gains the power stancing combo, which is good for multiple different reasons. One, it actually lets you get the ability to power stance while only having to level up one weapon. Every single time that you buff the weapon, let's say with Blood Flame Blade, it actually adds the buff onto both hands. And you also do get an extended power stancing moveset by actually adding in like different heavy attacks, jumping heavy attacks, and running heavies. Now, for the most part, I think the claws might just outclass the fists as these like small paired types of weapons, because claws would just typically have higher DPS, have more range, more weapon skill options, get slashing and piercing damage, while also having 110 crit. But the fist weapons are not going to be incredibly outclassed because they actually do more stance damage, and they typically can get higher amounts of AR. So if you're going to go with like charged heavy attack builds, I think the fists are just going to be the much better options. And as I mentioned, with paired weapons, you're going to have a unique heavy attack, because typically when you're power stancing and use a heavy attack, it's just going to swing one of the weapons. But with these types of ones, you're going to swing with both, which means a lot more damage, and it's still not going to have stance damage as a trade-off. All these fist weapons are doing about 33 stance damage, which is like just as much as like an axe or a straight sword or a spear. So some of these fists can make for some of the fastest stance-breaking weapons in the entire game and just output amazing damage. But I think that is going to be the only use that the fists have, because they don't really have many weapon skill options. They're not going to be good DPS in terms of light attacks, and they're going to have really, really poor range. So for the most part, this entire list, all 14 of this fist, I'm going to value things like charged heavy attack builds much more than anything else. And also, once again, do keep in mind, just like all the other weapon categories that I ranked, the weapons are going to be ranked from worst to best based on how well they perform and how useful they are in PvE. Starting off at the bottom, the Clinging Bone, which is one of the poking attack types of fist weapons, and I will get into more detail as to how the poking attack moveset differs from the other ones later on in the video. But this weapon actually does get some split magic damage and actually have an arcane scaling, but there is no status effect for this weapon at all. And the reason why it's going to get at the bottom is because it gets terrible damage, terrible scalings, not a unique skill, and cannot be infused. Like, this weapon gets stuck with a Lifesteal Fist, which one is borderline useless in PvE because you can only really use it against like a handful of enemies, and you could just put Lifesteal Fist on another weapon like the KATAR and get the exact same moveset, gets more damage, get it earlier in the game, get 110 crit, and just get more damage with the skill as well. Like, the only positive things I can say about it is that it does have a bit more range than the KATAR, and it does require Somber Stones, which means it's easier to upgrade, but I still would like never bother with this thing. Number 13, the Madding Hand, which is one of the new ones from the DLC. Now, this is just like a basic fist-based weapon, gets the exact same moveset as things like the Iron Balls, Star Fist, and even like just your bare fists in general. Now, this weapon cannot be infused, does get scalings in like basically every stat but Arcane, and also does come with passive Madness buildup, which is going to be like the main reason why it's going to get this low on the list, because it is just a PvE based list, and Madness basically does nothing in PvE unless you're fighting NPCs, to where this thing can be pretty decent. And if you are going to go with a faith-based build, you could go ahead and like level this thing up, just leave it in your back pocket and switch to it every single time that you actually wanted to just go fight NPCs. But there are so many different things that can just cheese them anyway, and leveling up an entire dedicated weapon just to have that one specific purpose might not be like the most ideal thing. It also does boost your damage if you do proc Madness upon yourself or nearby enemies. So maybe if you're going to go like a Madness build or use like Hellish Brew before a boss fight, it could be pretty useful there. But that's only if you're going to be doing like one-shotting types of builds or whatnot. So overall, it's just going to be pretty niche, and this is never going to be used as a primary option. And the fact that you get it very late in the game in like a very annoying location kind of makes you not really want to use it like ever. Number 12, THIOLLIER'S Hidden Needle, which is another DLC fist weapon, also getting the poking attack type of moveset. This one actually getting the worst amount of range compared to all the other poking attack fist weapons. Now, the THIOLLIER'S Hidden Needle in particular does actually come with Eternal Sleep as a passive status effect, and a unique skill called Sleep Evermore. Now, Sleep Evermore is basically just like an Impaling Thrust reskin. It does like less damage and have like less stance damage as regular Impaling Thrust. And Impaling Thrust on a fist weapon is not going to be the most amazing thing, because obviously you're not going to have much range. But the major benefit of the skill is that when you do have sleep procced onto an enemy, it makes it do like a lot more damage. Now, the damage difference is actually pretty significant. Now, unfortunately, this is mainly going to be more for PvP than it is PvE, because in PvE, it only affects enemies that are put to deep sleep. And if enemies are put to deep eternal sleep, they're not going to wake up anyway. So basically, the whole skill does bonus damage against enemies that are not going to wake up. So it's practically useless. Now, there are some instances to where you actually can do bonus damage where it's not deep sleep, but typically if you actually just do proc like the light sleep version, where enemies or bosses just get staggered for like a couple of seconds with the sleep, Using it in this instance doesn't actually do the bonus damage. Against NPCs and like in PvP, it actually does do the bonus damage, but for whatever reason against bosses, it just doesn't work. So you're just going to be doing the same shitty damage every single time with the skill. And in that instance, you're just better off using anything else, especially because that sleep is like a borderline useless skill that like almost every single boss is either just immune to or just incredibly resist to. And the most annoying thing is that sleep scales off arcane, and this thing didn't get an arcane scaling despite it being acquired off THIOLLIER, whose armor sets literally just boosts arcane and just has a whole bunch of like these poison based effects that all scale off arcane, and has his main primary weapon being like a poison based weapon that obviously scales off arcane. And in the description of this weapon, it states that it pairs well with poison types of builds, but it has like no synergy or no like special effect alongside the poison build. So yeah, this thing just feels like a massive, just big missed opportunity. Now, in terms of the instances to where you actually can do bonus damage despite enemies not being put to deep sleep, it's when they're in like the middle of like a hyper armor animation. Like some bosses are like guaranteed to do certain attacks and they have to finish the animation before they can actually start their sleeping animation. And in those instances, you can just do like the bonus damage with the skill. It's like incredibly like situational and like very, very niche to the point where it's like not really worth using, but it is worthy to note. And also against the Godskin duo, it's pretty useful as well because Eternal Sleep only lasts like 5 seconds before they can be woken up. So this weapon can destroy them very quickly. But the way this weapon needs to be changed is that any single time that enemies have that purple effect around them, they just should be taking bonus damage to this. It also should have an arcane scaling, and it should have like some type of synergy with poison, whether or not it actually like helps it boost the damage, or also just make it do more damage as long as enemies are poisoned, or maybe have the skill just proc poison itself would be pretty cool. It feels like there's so many things that could make this weapon like a top tier option, but unfortunately it's like a very short range, low damaging weapon with a pretty poor skill. Number 11, the CAESTUS, which actually is the lightest of all the infusible based fist weapons, and it also does have very low requirements too. So if you actually wanted to have like an offhand striking based option, or just any different type of secondary option if you were lacking striking damage, to just go through like catacombs or dungeons and fight those enemies that are very weak to striking damage, this could be a good option. But I think that's the only use that it does have, because otherwise you could just use the spiked CAESTUS, because that weapon like weighs like half a unit more, has like the slightest bit higher dexterity requirements, gets the exact same moveset but just gets more damage and gets passive bleed, and you can get it earlier as well. Like the CAESTUS is a perfectly fine weapon, and I'll talk about its heavy attack once I get to the spiked CAESTUS, but there's basically no reason to use it when the spiked CAESTUS exists. Number 10, the CIPHER, which is a pure holy damaging weapon with a pure faith scaling and faith requirement. Also just weighs 0 units, which is like the lightest weapon in the entire game. Now, it's not going to get the most amazing damage by any means, but the benefit of just having one damage type is that you don't have to go through multiple defenses, and if you're using elemental buffs like the Sacred Scorpion Charm or the Holy Tier, you're going to benefit way more. Now, the major use of these weapons is to be paired alongside like a casting type of build. If you wanted to have like a faith build where you're just primarily going to be using weapons, you're still going to benefit a bit more of just having like a sidearm option, and the CIPHER just might be that thing for you. Now, unfortunately, it's going to get lower on the list because the Coded Sword exists, and the Coded Sword basically is the exact same thing, a pure holy weapon with just a pure faith requirement, doesn't weigh that much, but it's just going to be the better weapon type because it just values straight swords more, and it's going to get the much better skill. Unblockable Blade for the Coded Sword like extends the weapon by like 3 times the amount, shoots out this attack in this massive AoE that does amazing damage, amazing stance damage, whereas Unblockable Blade for the CIPHER has like a reskinned version of Impaling Thrust, and for whatever reason that actually doesn't extend the weapon like it does with the Coded Sword, so it's still going to be a very short range weapon, which is still going to stagger nicely and do an okay amount of stance damage, but the Coded Sword variant is way better. And if you're going to be using like primarily spells, I think you'd rather have a weapon that you're just going to be using one-handed, whereas for the CIPHER you're going to be two-handing, and to switch back and forth between your spells can be a bit tedious. Now, this could be seen as like an earlier game option because you can get it right at the round table hold, but it does have a 30 faith requirement, and by the time that you get to 30 faith, you're more likely than not going to be somewhat close to like Lendel, where you actually get the Coded Sword, and you're probably just better off going with that one instead. Number 9, the Veteran's PROSTHESIS, which is a strength dexterity based fist weapon, does actually get some of the most range in class, also gets some split lightning damage as well, and also cannot be infused, so there's no real like synergy with different types of spells, as it does only get that quality scaling. It also does get the poking attack moveset, which I typically don't like, as I will get into in a little bit. It's mainly for the reason that it doesn't really get good stance damage with its charged heavy attacks, but just having access to piercing damage is obviously going to be really good. But the main reason why it's going to get into the C tier is because of its skill Storm Kick, which is is like one of like the biggest missed opportunities for a skill, or probably just as a weapon as a whole. Like this thing could have been so much better. But Storm Kick for only 10 FP does this like little short range wind based AoE, which since the DLC releasing it does get boosted by things like the in range Divine Beast Talisman. The damage is not going to be amazing by any means, but it actually does give you the option of a follow-up lightning attack, and this lightning attack doesn't actually consume any additional FP and does really good damage. So like the entire combo is extremely efficient. Now the problems being is that most of the damage comes from that lightning attack, and it's going to take a long time to get there. You basically get like next to no hyper armor. It does like jump in the air, but you can't even like jump over attacks when using this skill, which is like really weird to me. It also has pretty poor hit detection, like sometimes it just like overshoots the target and it completely misses. And you're going to have pretty long recovery frames too, so you're going to get hit like almost every single time that you use it. Like I don't know why the skill just didn't actually work like a kicking attack. That way it probably could have got boosted by like the Shattered Stone Talisman as of the DLC. Would have been nice if it could have been reworked as like a hand-to-hand weapon for the DLC releasing and had some like cool kicking moveset alongside with it. And also another annoying thing, you get this weapon off Niall in the mountaintop of the giants, and when he does this stomping attack, it does this massive frost AoE, but when we get it, it's just like a regular like wind physical based AoE attack. And it needs to have like a lot better tracking too. So yeah, for the most part, this thing is just very disappointing. Number 8, the KATAR, which is an infusible based fist that actually does offer some of the worst damage in class. Basically every single infusion, almost every single other infusible fist can just get more damage, but this weapon can be acquired relatively earlier on in the game. Does actually come with some split piercing and slashing damage, as it does have that poking attack moveset. Also does get 110 crit, so it's very comparable to something like the claws. They also get slashing, piercing damage, 110 crit, and a poking attack type of heavy. But the thing is, the claws are also going to get passive bleed, get more skill options, and get much better movesets, as their light attacks offer you some of the highest DPS in the entire game. Now, one thing that I did mention at the start of the video is that fist weapons will actually get you a bit more stance damage, and it just makes their charged heavy attack builds be a lot better. But the thing is, with the KATAR, it gets 15 stance damage, which is like literally less than half the amount of stance damage compared to all the other fist weapons. It's also even less than a claw as well with a charged heavy attack. It's always been that way, and it hasn't been fixed at all. Like it feels like it has to be like a bug. And this is not just for the KATAR, like basically every single poking attack type of fist weapon that actually offers you this piercing damage. Like all these heavy attacks just do terrible stance damage for some reason. And funnily enough, if you actually have this weapon one-handed, it does 30 stance damage with a charged heavy attack, which literally makes no sense, but that is going to be the reason why this thing does get into the B tier, because the fist weapon's one-handed charged heavy attacks come out really fast and obviously do like amazing stance damage, so you can stance break really quickly with this particular type of build. And the fact that you get it very early on, and it's going to offer you piercing damage, and with how easy it is to build around a charged heavy attack build, it's not going to be that bad of an option. I kind of wish it could be infused with certain types of poking attack skills, because it does come passive with Impaling Thrust, but it can't be infused with Impaling Thrust. But another reason why it's not going to get much higher is because the Parter exists, and this is basically the exact same thing, but it just offers you more damage and more range too. Number 7, the Grafted Dragon, which is a faith and strength based fist weapon that works a lot differently to the others, and that it cannot be two-handed, so therefore you're going to be stuck just one-handing it the entire time, unless you find another fist weapon to put in your offhand so you can actually do the power sensing combo. So this is just obviously going to be a major downside. Just only being limited to like the one-handed fist moveset is not going to be ideal. Now thankfully the charge attacks are still going to be really quick and do just as much stance damage as I mentioned with the KATAR, but it doesn't get a unique moveset at all. Every single fist weapon gets the exact same moveset and exact same stance damage when you have them one-handed. And if you just go with an infusible fist weapon, it's going to get more damage. You can put Cragblade onto it, and it's just going to perform much better with a charged heavy attack build compared to the Grafted Dragon. So yeah, I don't know why this thing could not be two-handed at all. It would have made it a lot more unique, especially because they literally designed a torch in the DLC with a unique two-handed light attack combo that looks like it could have been for the Grafted Dragon, and yet they just didn't really care to like animate like a unique two-handed combo. Like this is a remembrance weapon of the first major remembrance boss, and then didn't give it a unique moveset, but this random ass torch in the DLC got one. Doesn't make any sense. But thankfully, its skill is actually pretty useful. In Bear Witness, it actually does serve as a pretty high damaging fire-based AoE attack. The AoE explosion itself doesn't really go that far. You have to be like pretty close to an enemy, and it does have quite a bit of a long starting up animation. That doesn't really get any hype armor, but you are lower to the ground, so a lot of attacks can go over your head. Now, thankfully, the recovery frames are basically instant. Like, soon as you like explode the weapon, you can just roll out of it straight away. And it does leave out like a bunch of these like little fire pits in a pretty wide area. It doesn't do much damage, but it is going to be a little bit more, which is definitely not a downside. So if you are surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, or if you wanted to like just send smaller enemies flying to the ground, or just do like high amounts of damage in one hit, this skill can be very useful. But yeah, unfortunately, it just cannot be two-handed. so its moveset is going to be lacking. If you could just two-hand this thing, and if it is offered like a different moveset, I'd probably put it into the A tier, but B tier is really as high as it can go. Number 6, the Spiked CAESTUS, which is one of the earliest fist-based weapons that you can actually go acquire. It's only like a 1-minute ride away from like the Guts' Greatsword and the Dragon Burrow. And it actually is going to be a decent damaging bleed-based fist weapon too that can be infused. And obviously bleed as a status effect is amazing, and this being a paired weapon or a power stance weapon, it means that it can proc bleed pretty quickly, especially if you throw Blood Flame Blade onto the top of it, because using Blood Flame Blade actually puts the effect onto both hands. Now the thing is, if you actually wanted to have like this short-range bleed-based weapon, I'd rather just go with the claws because it does have much better DPS, have more range, and also does offer you 110 crit. And just getting the mix up of both slashing damage and piercing damage is going to be more useful in my opinion. But the Spiked CAESTUS can be acquired earlier and does get a pretty good charged heavy attack. It is also going to be like a 1-2 punch, which is similar to like the poking attack fist weapons, but thankfully it actually does do respectable stance damage with that same 33 stance as all the other fist weapons get. Now the major problem with this heavy attack is that it literally gets less damage than all the other ones. Like for some reason the motion values are just lower, and most of the damage and most of the stance damage comes off the second hit, which means there might be instances to where you actually only hit with the first attack and get staggered out before the second one lands, and you're just missing out on a whole bunch more damage and stance damage. And also this thing is going to be directly outclassed by the Star Fist, which is another blade-based fist weapon that you do get a little bit later in the game, but that weapon just gets more damage and just gets the much better heavy attack as it comes out faster and just does more damage too. So I think its major use is it's going to be like another CAESTUS if you just wanted to have like a secondary striking based weapon to go through some dungeons, and also just having like a lighter option that can proc bleed with lower requirements and just do some nice stance damage. Like it's pretty good overall, but the Star Fist is going to be the much better primary option. Number 5, the Iron Balls, which is one of the best weapons in the entire game. Like this thing can just straight up just destroy everything from start to finish. Those charged heavy attacks come out instantly, do 33 stance damage every single time, don't consume much stamina, and it can make for one of the fastest stance breaking weapons in the entire game. Now the only reason why it's still going to get into the B tier is because the Star Fist exists. And the Star Fist is basically the exact same weapon with the exact same moveset, but it just gets more damage with every infusion and gets passive bleed. So it's just like the infinitely more useful weapon. It does like weigh the slightest bit more and have like the slightest bit higher requirements, but it's barely noticeable, and this is going to be the direct upgrade. Now obviously you can get to the Iron Balls a bit earlier in the game, especially if you do kill Bogart early, but for most people I kind of recommend just doing a bit of his quest line so you can actually unlock the boiled crabs, and at that point you're going to be killing him in the Altus Plateau, and right next to the Altus Plateau is Lendel where you pick up the Star Fists. So at best the use for the Iron Balls is that it's going to be like a good option to kill like 3 or 4 bosses until you get the Star Fist, then you just use that throughout the rest of the game. Number 4, the Poisoned Hand, another weapon from the DLC. This one getting the exact same moveset as things like the Iron Brawl and the Star Fist, which does involve those really fast charged heavy attacks. Now this one cannot be infused and does only offer you an arcane scaling with pretty poor base damage, so if you actually did want to go with those charged heavy attack builds, the Star Fist and Iron Balls are just gonna perform better. But this actually does have a few different uses. One, it actually does come with passive deadly poison, and with this thing getting an A scaling and arcane, it can proc it very quickly, especially with the unique skill that it does have, which is like this short range punching attack. But with this attack, it can easily proc poison on like every single boss within like 1 to 2 hits. And you also get a special effect of getting bonus damage when you do proc poison. You gain roughly around 7.5% more damage every single time that you proc it on an enemy or get procced with it yourself. And this effect does stack with things like the Kindred of Rot Exaltation and the Mushroom Crown. So any single time that you're going to go with a poison build, you can just leave this in the offhand because you don't actually have to proc poison with the weapon itself as long as you just have it equipped. But even if you didn't have a poison build, and let's say you had like a bleed based arcane build, I would still probably use the weapon. You can just start off the boss fight using the fist, just punch them like once or twice, they'll proc deadly poison, and then switch back to your main weapons, and you just gain a bunch more damage, and just have the boss take roughly around 5% damage over the next 30 seconds. So yes, its main use is going to be a secondary option, but as a primary option, it does have a very specific use, because it only weighs 1 unit and does pure physical damage, so therefore, with those blue dancer charm types of builds, where you're not going to really be using much armor, specifically with things like the Rock Heart transformation and those Dragon Communion Dragon Maw builds, the Poison Hands might actually make for one of the best pairings. So it's not going to be like the highest damaging option, probably not going to be the best arcane option, but there are plenty of different uses for the Poison Hand that makes it an A tier. Number 3, the Golem Fist, which this weapon has gotten better with patch after patch, and I did just do a run today with it on stream only using the charged heavy attacks, and it performed extremely well. This is an infusible fist that actually does get the highest damage in class, and yes, it can even outdamage the Star Fist with basically every single infusion. Now it does have a bit higher requirements, specifically with that strength stat, so you're kind of really only limited to a strength type of build. but the damage is just undeniable, and it also gets a unique heavy attack too that shoots out a projectile. Now the projectile itself does not do good damage, does roughly around 15 stance damage at a distance, which is not too bad. I do like to use the projectile attacks, specifically the uncharged version, as it's a way to just stop enemies from regenerating their poise. It's also just very handy to fight flying types of enemies too. But at point blank range is where it truly shines, because as of the recent patches, it now gets a hitbox at closer range, and it now does work with things like the axe talisman, spiked tear, and smithing talisman, and the damage is just ridiculous. Like, this thing can hit super hard and melt enemies really quickly, and it can also proc status effects at an absurd rate too. Pairing this alongside a bleed based infusion, you can get over 300 bleed buildup with just one charged heavy attack, which is just ridiculous. Like, that's almost Blood Fiend's arm type of bleed buildup, but with a fist weapon instead. Now there are going to be a handful of downsides, unfortunately. The major one being is that it consumes ridiculous amounts of stamina. Like, this thing consumes like 150 stamina, which is like twice as much as almost every other fist weapon. And I was playing with this weapon with like 40 endurance, and it is like 2 charged heavy attacks, my entire stamina bar is gone. It also doesn't do as much stance damage either. Like, the Starfist charged heavy attacks do about 33 stance damage, where this one is actually only doing 31 stance damage. And the fact that it is like a projectile type of weapon means that it can't be paired with a lot of different types of weapon buffs. Things like Crag Blade, Royal Knight Resolve, Blood Flame Blade, different types of Grease, Flaming Strike, none of them can be paired alongside the Golem Fist, which is like extremely unfortunate. If I could just pair it alongside Crag Blade, we would have like a much better charged heavy attack build. But unfortunately, you're limited to the Shriek of Sorrow, which is still like a decent weapon buff. I don't value it as much of Crag Blade, but yeah, this is the only thing that you can really pair alongside to help boost the damage of these charged heavies. So all in all, I don't think it's going to be better than the Starfist in terms of a charged heavy attack build, but it can definitely proc bleed quicker, and you're still going to have the option of like a free projectile attack. The projectile doesn't go that far, but when you're fighting enemies like to move around a whole bunch, or that have like these really weird like hitboxes to where like you can't hit them with a fist weapon, because at the very least you're going to hit with the projectile. But yeah, the stamina cost and their inability to be paired alongside Crag Blade kind of stops me from putting this thing into the S tier. Number 2, the PATA, which is another fist-based weapon that you acquire from the DLC, also is infusible and is very comparable to the KATAR from the base game, as it does get the exact same moveset, but it just offers you more damage and much more range. Like, this thing gets like straight sword types of range, and it's a fist weapon. And if you were a person that was using things like the Star Fist, but you just did not like the short range that it had because you were whiffing way too many times, I honestly recommend going with the PATA. Now, this poking attack moveset, as I did mention earlier, is pretty good because it does offer you piercing damage. The running attacks are very nice. Now, for the most part, this moveset is still going to be outclassed by the claws because the light attack combos are going to be better, and the heavy attacks even just do more stance damage because for some reason, the charged heavy attacks only do 15 stance damage when you have them two-handed, but when you have the weapon one-handed, it does 30 stance damage, which is probably what you're seeing in the gameplay right now, is just me spamming just one-handed charged heavy attacks, which these charged heavy attacks come out incredibly fast, and you're going to be hitting at a further distance and also doing piercing damage. So using this particular type of build is honestly going to be really good. And if you really wanted to still retain like the cool light attack combos, you could just have like another PATA on your offhand or any other type of fist weapon, and you could just power stance those. But for the most part, you can just like very well just spam heavy attacks the entire time, and it'll just work out for you. Like, these are incredibly fast and go really far. It's probably not going to stance break nor do anywhere near as much damage as a Star Fist, because obviously you're hitting with 2 weapons at once, and it's basically just as fast as an animation. But its range and piercing damage potential definitely gives it enough uses for this thing to be a high A tier. Number 1, the Starfist, which is one of the best stance-breaking weapons in the entire game, and it also does come with passive bleed. So basically, a lot of the things that trivialize PvE is just thrown into this one weapon. It's really light, it's quick, its charged heavy attacks are hitting with 2 separate weapons because it is a paired weapon, where typically if you're using charged heavy attacks in a power stancing combo, you're only going to be hitting with 1. And you're going to be doing spear or axe type of stance damage and like an incredibly fast animation. Like, these charged heavy attacks are like faster than some light attacks that other weapons have. And funnily enough, the motion values for these charged heavy attacks are literally higher than all the other ones that the fist weapons get. And it's not even that much later into the game, only at Lendel. So once you get your hands on this thing, paired alongside a strength build with Blood Flame Blade or Crag Blade, going into an occult infusion, and all into arcane to get a bunch of bleed build up, like, it doesn't really matter how you really build around it. It's going to make for a broken ass weapon. Just keep spamming charged heavy attacks, and everything is just going to be destroyed. It's probably not going to be like the easiest thing to use due to its really short range, but if you do have a strength build or an arcane build, you're going to have access to spells anyway to serve as projectile options if things are too far away from you. But yeah, even still, there's like a very few select weapons in this game that are better than the Starfists. Okay, that is the video now done, and that is basically every single like weapon category for the base game now completed. I can now at this point go into things like bows or maybe catalysts like seals and staffs, or potentially go into the DLC types of weapon categories, so do let me know down in the comments what you would like to see next. Also, do follow me on Twitch as well, because I'm live there basically every day doing a bunch of challenge runs, testing out all these weapons, doing these Ash of War runs, spell runs, charged heavy attacks, whatever it may be. So if those things do interest you, definitely do pop by. Anyway, catch you guys around. See ya.